It is 5:30 in the morning. The date is March 6, 1836. Davy Crockett, folk hero, bear hunter, former United States congressman, is about to die. He just does not know how. And 200 years later, neither do we. Right now, in the pre-dawn darkness of South Texas, a man who once stood on the floor of the House of Representatives is crouching behind a crumbling wall of timber and packed earth, gripping a rifle he can no longer reload, while somewhere in the black 2,000 soldiers are forming into columns and preparing to come from every direction at once. In 90 minutes, he and nearly every man beside him will be dead. There are two versions of what happens to him in those 90 minutes. The heroic version says his body was found surrounded by no fewer than 16 dead Mexican soldiers, a ring of carnage around a man who refused to fall, who fought until the men killing him outnumbered the seconds he had left. His rifle swung overhead as a club when the powder ran out, his fists when the rifle broke. A man who made 16 soldiers pay the price of killing him. That version has been told in every American schoolroom, painted on canvases, filmed in Hollywood epics, and enshrined in the cultural memory of a nation that needed its heroes to die on their feet. The disturbing version comes from a Mexican officer's diary, a man who was present on the battlefield that morning, who wrote it down with the detail of a witness, not a storyteller. He claims Crockett was captured alive in the battle's final minutes, brought before the commanding general, and executed by bayonet while standing unarmed in the rubble. 200 years have not settled it. For 200 years, these two versions have waged their own war. One of them is a legend. One may be the truth, and one of them fundamentally changes everything you think you know about the most famous last stand in American history. But here is what both versions agree on without dispute. Davy Crockett walked into the Alamo of his own free will. He was assigned to defend its weakest point, and on the morning of March 6, 1836, he did not leave. To understand which version is true, or whether the truth lies somewhere neither account can reach, we need to understand the man himself. Not the legend, the man. The Davy Crockett who arrived at the Alamo in early February of 1836 was 49 years old. He was not a young man seeking glory. He was a middle-aged politician who had run out of runway. He had served 2 terms in the United States Congress, representing Tennessee, won election twice on the strength of a frontier personality that newspapers loved and constituents adored. Then he lost his 3rd re-election bid. According to legend, when his constituents voted him out, Crockett told them directly, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." That sentence has been quoted for nearly 2 centuries, as though it were the declaration of a man marching toward destiny. It was not. It was the declaration of a man going to start over. Texas, in 1836, offered what Tennessee no longer could. Land was cheap. Opportunity was real. The revolution against Santa Anna's government had created space for men willing to fight, and fighting was something Crockett understood better than congressional procedure. He arrived with a small group of Tennessee mounted volunteers and a reputation that walked through doors before he did. The name alone changed the arithmetic inside the Alamo's walls. Men who might have slipped away in the night decided to stay because Davy Crockett was staying. That kind of gravity is rare. It is also, in a siege, a trap of its own kind. The Alamo itself was never designed to be a fortress. It was a crumbling former mission covering roughly 3 acres of ground, with walls too long for any garrison to properly defend, and gaps that no amount of engineering could fully close. Holding it was a gamble. Abandoning it felt like surrender. The men inside chose to stay, and that choice sealed their fate. Command was fractured. William Barrett Travis led the regular soldiers. James Bowie commanded the volunteers until illness confined him to his cot, leaving Travis in effective command of men who had never fully accepted his authority. The siege had begun on February 23rd, when Mexican cavalry appeared on the outskirts of San Antonio. For 13 days, Mexican artillery had bombarded the compound. The walls shook. Dust filled every breath. Sleep was something stolen in fragments between explosions. The men inside could hear the bombardment not just with their ears, but through the soles of their feet, through their hands on the cold ground, through their teeth. A sustained artillery siege does something to the human body and mind that no training prepares you for. It is not the fear of a single moment. It is the grinding accumulation of dread, the knowledge that the next explosion might be the one that finds you, hour after hour, day after day, until the nerves stop flinching, because flinching itself becomes too exhausting. 13 days of that, and then the silence. 32 men from Gonzales slipped through the Mexican lines on March 1st, an act of extraordinary courage that added rifles but could not change the mathematics. The garrison remained fatally outnumbered, and everyone inside knew it. Crockett had been assigned to defend the low Palisade wall, a barricade of timber and packed earth stretching between the church and the compound's south wall. It was the lowest structure in the entire defense, lower than the stone walls, less reinforced, more exposed. Everyone understood what this meant. If the Mexicans reached this wall in numbers, there would be nothing between them and the interior of the Alamo. Crockett was assigned to defend the most vulnerable position in the compound with the fewest men, the least cover, and the most exposure to direct fire. Whether this was an honor or a death sentence depends entirely on how you define honor. In those final weeks, it was both. He could have argued against the assignment. A man of his reputation had the standing to push back. He did not. He took the position, fortified it as best he could with what was available, and he held it. For the entire 13 days of the siege, the palisade held. Not because it was strong, because the men behind it refused to leave. And Crockett was the reason men stayed behind it. On the night of March 5th, something changed. The Mexican artillery fell silent. For the first time in 13 days, the guns stopped. The quiet that settled over the compound was not comforting. It was the held breath before a scream. Something was coming. Every man inside knew it. Santa Anna had assembled more than 2,000 soldiers for the final assault. 4 attack columns, each assigned to strike a different face of the compound simultaneously. These were veteran troops, battle-hardened from campaigns against other rebellious Mexican states. They carried Brown Bess muskets fitted with bayonets, and it was the bayonet, not the bullet, that Santa Anna expected to decide this battle. The columns included cazadores, light infantry sharpshooters trained to pick off defenders on the walls. Behind the assault force, cavalry was positioned to cut down anyone who tried to flee. This was not an improvised attack. It was a coordinated annihilation plan. Inside the Alamo, the defenders numbered somewhere between 180 and 260 men. Their long rifles were accurate at distances Mexican smoothbore muskets could not match. They also held approximately 20 artillery pieces along the perimeter, loaded with grapeshot and scrap metal. A single blast of grapeshot into a packed column of infantry could cut down dozens, but there were not enough men to cover every section of wall. Gaps existed. Santa Anna knew exactly where they were. At 5:30 in the morning, a bugle call shattered the darkness. Then the roar of hundreds of voices. Viva Santa Anna! The sound hit the walls before the men did. 4 columns surged forward simultaneously from every direction. Travis reportedly shouted to his men, "Come on, boys! The Mexicans are upon us, and we'll give them hell." The Texian gunners lit their fuses. The first artillery blasts ripped into the advancing columns at close range, grapeshot and scrap metal tearing through packed infantry ranks. The effect was devastating. Men went down in clusters. Files disappeared. The advance faltered, then reformed, and pushed forward again. This is the moment that defines how a numerical advantage works in warfare. It does not work by winning exchanges. It works by absorbing losses that would destroy a smaller force and continuing to close the distance. The first wave dies. The second wave steps over them. The third wave reaches the wall. Here was the terrible mathematics of the battle. Every defender had to account for 10 attackers, and the attackers only needed to reach the wall. The columns kept coming. There were simply too many. At the Palisade, Crockett and his Tennesseans were firing as fast as they could load. The cazadores were concentrating fire directly at the Palisade, picking off any defender who exposed himself to aim. These were not ordinary infantry. They were sharpshooters, whose specific purpose was to neutralize defenders on walls before the main columns arrived. They targeted the men who had to stand up to fire, the men who had to show their heads and shoulders to aim their rifles. At the Palisade, that meant every man trying to hold that low wall was a marked target the moment he raised his weapon. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid and blinding. The only light came from muzzle flashes, brief orange explosions that revealed screaming faces and then plunged everything back into darkness. Crockett would have been directing fire, choosing targets, steadying the men around him with whatever calm a man can summon when every second brings another wave of men over his wall. On the north wall, a section of crumbled fortification gave way. Mexican soldiers poured through. Officers ordered the captured Texian cannons wheeled around and aimed inward, back into the compound itself. The defenders' own artillery was now being used to kill them. In that moment, the Alamo stopped being a fortress. It became a trap. Every man inside had just become a target. The battle was barely 45 minutes old. The walls were falling. Mexican soldiers were flooding the courtyard. And at the Palisade, Crockett's men were about to face what no amount of courage could prepare them for. With the north wall fallen and Mexican troops flooding the interior of the compound, the Palisade defenders were now being attacked from two directions simultaneously. The original assault columns pressing hard from the front, and freshly arrived soldiers flanking them from within the courtyard itself. The Tennesseans were caught in a closing vice. Crockett's men had been firing for nearly an hour without pause. Their rifle barrels were scorching hot, too hot to touch without burning skin. Some had warped from sustained use. Powder and shot were running dangerously low. Several men were completely out of ammunition. The long rifles that had dropped Mexican soldiers at 100 yards, the weapons that had given the Palisade its lethal reach, were now dead weight unless they could be reloaded. There was no time to reload. The columns had closed the distance. They were at the wall. They were over the wall. What happened next was the most visceral passage of the entire battle. Unable to reload, Crockett's men flipped their rifles and swung the heavy wooden stocks into the faces and bodies of Mexican soldiers climbing over the Palisade. Others drew knives, hunting knives, whatever blade they carried on their belts. The fighting became hand-to-hand, body-to-body, a savage tangle of limbs and steel beyond anything resembling organized combat. Mexican bayonets thrust forward in disciplined ranks. Tennessean frontiersmen fought back, with the desperate improvisation of men who understood with absolute clarity that there was no retreat, no rescue, no exit. Consider what the Palisade looked like at this moment. Dozens of men compressed into a space smaller than a suburban backyard, fighting over a wall of timber and packed dirt that had already been breached in multiple places. The dead underfoot, the wounded trying to rise. Mexican soldiers climbing over bodies to reach defenders who were swinging rifles like clubs. The Palisade became a writhing mass of struggling bodies, living and dead tangled together, the packed earth wall dark and slick beneath them. The sounds were not gunfire anymore. They were grunting, and the rasp of exhausted breathing and screaming, and the dull percussion of impact that does not echo the way a gunshot does. This is combat stripped of everything except the animal will to survive one more second. No rank, no strategy, no legend, Just a man and the weight of what is in his hands and the body in front of him that keeps coming, regardless of what he does. Where exactly Crockett stood in this maelstrom, no surviving account can say with certainty. What we know is that he was there. The man who had told Tennessee to go to hell was somewhere in that desperate knot of men making their final stand at the weakest point in the Alamo's defense. We know he was fighting. We know the Palisade was falling. We know the Tennesseans were overwhelmed. And we know that when the fighting at the Palisade ended, when the low wall had held far longer than anyone expected but could hold no longer, the question of Davy Crockett's fate fractured into two irreconcilable stories. The Palisade fell. The Mexican bayonets finished what the converging assault had begun. The killing did not stop at the walls. It followed the survivors inside. Mexican soldiers battered down doors and fired blind into darkened rooms. Cannon were dragged to the doorways of the barracks and discharged point-blank into enclosed stone spaces, where the blast alone was nearly incomprehensible. Room by room, the Alamo was cleared. Each room had its own brief, brutal story. A barricaded door, a cannon dragged to the threshold and fired, the concussion of a discharge inside a stone room, traveling through floors and walls and bodies. Then soldiers pushing through the smoke into what was left. Room by room, the defense died. And then the firing stopped. The sudden silence was as disorienting as the noise had been. Smoke drifted through the compound in slow gray clouds. Men stood in the wreckage, chests heaving, many of them wounded, all of them stunned by the ferocity of what they had just endured and survived. In the sudden silence, between 5 and 7 Texians were found still breathing, pulled from rooms, discovered among the bodies, captured in the final disintegrating minutes of the fight. For a brief, fragile moment, it appeared these men might live. One of them, according to at least one account, may have been Davy Crockett. The surviving prisoners were exhausted, bloodied, some of them grievously wounded. They were disarmed and brought before Mexican officers. Santa Anna entered the compound shortly after the fighting ended. General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, a senior officer present at the battle, presented the captured survivors to his commanding general. Castrillon was a professional soldier who had served Mexico through multiple campaigns. He had watched those men defend the compound against impossible odds. He understood what soldiers who fight like that deserve. According to multiple Mexican accounts, Castrillon hoped Santa Anna would show clemency. The battle was won. The garrison was destroyed. The men before him were unarmed and no longer capable of resistance. Even in the brutal calculus of 19th century warfare, killing disarmed prisoners after a battle was won was not military necessity. It was something else entirely. What happened next was not decided by soldiers. It was decided by one man, and the order he gave would become the most controversial moment of the entire Texas Revolution. Santa Anna was furious. He had not ordered prisoners to be taken. He had ordered no quarter. The red flag raised above San Fernando Church 13 days earlier, the blood-red banner visible from the Alamo walls, had carried an explicit promise: no mercy. No survivors. He demanded the immediate execution of every man standing before him. Castrillon reportedly protested. Other officers looked away or stood in uncomfortable silence. But the order stood. It was not a request. Mexican soldiers, some accounts say officers eager to demonstrate loyalty to their general, stepped forward and put the unarmed men to death with bayonets. The executions were carried out right there in the rubble of the compound these men had just defended, with everything they had. Think about what this moment reveals. The battle was over. The Alamo had fallen. Santa Anna held a complete victory. Every military objective had been achieved. And in that moment of total triumph, he chose to kill men who could no longer threaten him. Men who were standing still, hands at their sides, too exhausted to resist. That choice tells you more about Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna than any battlefield order ever could. It is also the moment where Davy Crockett's story splits into two versions that 2 centuries of scholarship have not resolved. José Enrique de la Peña was a Mexican army officer present at the battle. He later wrote in his diary that Davy Crockett was among the 5 to 7 men captured and executed on Santa Anna's orders. According to de la Peña, the prisoners stood exhausted and fight-weary before the general, and were killed not in the heat of combat, but on the cold command of a dictator's whim. De la Peña described the scene with the specificity of a man writing about something he witnessed rather than something he imagined. He named Crockett. He described the survivor's condition. He recorded Castrillon's protest. These are not the details of a fabrication. They are the details of a man trying to put down on paper what he saw and could not unsee. But then there is the other evidence, the physical evidence. If de la Peña's account is accurate, then the most famous frontiersman in American history did not die swinging his rifle in a blaze of glory. He died unarmed, standing in the rubble of the wall he had defended, killed by men following an order from a man who had already won. But not every account agrees. Other witnesses, both Mexican and Texian, described Crockett falling during the battle itself, at or near the palisade he had defended. And then there is the detail that has embedded itself most deeply into American memory. Crockett's body was reportedly found surrounded by no fewer than 16 dead Mexican soldiers, a ring of carnage around a single man. A detail that does not speak of surrender or capture. It speaks of a man who died on his feet, who took an extraordinary toll before they brought him down, who made 16 soldiers pay the price of killing him. Both accounts claim to be the truth. The physical evidence, the body surrounded by the dead, points toward a man who died fighting. The written testimony of an eyewitness officer points toward execution. The truth may live in the gray space between these accounts, or it may be irrecoverable, lost in the smoke and blood and contradictory testimony of a morning when hundreds of men were dying in a space no larger than a city block, and no one was keeping careful notes. 2 accounts, 2 deaths, 2 Davy Crocketts, and the argument that erupted between them would outlast the republic these men died to create. Among those spared the slaughter inside the Alamo were a small number of non-combatants. Susanna Dickinson, wife of artillery officer Almaron Dickinson, survived the battle with her infant daughter Angelina. She had sheltered in the sacristy of the church through the entire assault, hearing the fighting move closer room by room until it crashed through the walls around her. Santa Anna summoned her afterward and reportedly offered to adopt the child. She refused. He then sent her east with a message. This is what happens to those who resist. That message was intended to spread terror through the Texian settlements. What it spread instead was fury. Susanna Dickinson's journey east carried not just a general's threat, but the raw grief of a woman who had listened to her husband die on the other side of a wall and could not reach him. Her account became the primary Texian eyewitness source for the battle. Also among the survivors was Joe, an enslaved man owned by William Barrett Travis, who was present when Travis was killed in the opening minutes of the assault. Joe had no choice in being at the Alamo. He was there because his enslaver was there. He survived the battle by concealing himself during the worst of the fighting. His testimony provided crucial early details about the sequence of the breach and the collapse of the perimeter. His account was valued for its military intelligence. His freedom was not granted. He would later escape the custody of the Texian government that had recorded his testimony. The revolution he had survived was not fought for him, and he understood that clearly enough to act on it. 6 weeks after the Alamo fell, Sam Houston's army caught Santa Anna's forces at San Jacinto and destroyed them in 18 minutes. Texian soldiers screaming, "Remember the Alamo," as they charged across the open ground. Santa Anna was captured alive. Texas won its independence. The men who died inside those walls lost the battle. They won the war. And no one's death echoed louder through the years that followed than the man who had told Tennessee to go to hell. In the decades after the battle, The mythology grew faster than the scholarship. Davy Crockett was transformed from a complex, politically shrewd, deeply human frontiersman into a one-dimensional folk hero, frozen at the moment of his death. The coonskin cap legend, who died swinging old Betsy overhead, surrounded by a ring of enemies he had killed. This version made for better newspaper copy, better dime novels, better campfire stories. It gave a young nation a story it could use, a story of individual defiance against overwhelming force, of the frontier spirit refusing to bow to tyranny. The fact that Crockett had arrived in Texas as a middle-aged politician looking for a fresh start rather than a crusading hero was a detail that did not serve the narrative and was therefore quietly discarded. John Wayne's 1960 film cemented the heroic death into cultural gospel for an entire generation. Then, in the 1970s, De La Peña's account gained wider scholarly attention, and it detonated like a bomb in the mythology. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Historians who championed De La Peña argued that his account was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by other Mexican sources. Those who attacked it called it a forgery, an exaggeration, a politically motivated fabrication. The debate became so heated it transcended scholarship entirely and became something closer to a culture war. Was questioning Crockett's heroic death an act of historical honesty, a necessary reckoning with the difference between myth and fact? Or was it an attack on American identity itself, an attempt to tear down a symbol that millions of people needed to believe in? Here is the harder truth. Both of those things can be simultaneously real. History often works that way. The need for myth and the demand for accuracy are both genuine human impulses, and they do not resolve cleanly. The existing accounts offer enough ambiguity to sustain both interpretations, perhaps permanently. But the argument itself, the 200-year war between the two versions, reveals something more important than either story alone. Whatever happened in those final seconds at the Alamo, there are things that neither version disputes. Davy Crockett walked into that compound of his own free will. He was not conscripted. He was not ordered there. He made a choice. A 49-year-old man who had run out of political road and found a different kind of frontier. He was assigned to defend the weakest point in the entire perimeter, the low palisade of timber and packed earth, and he went to it without protest. For 13 days under bombardment, he stayed. He did not ask to be reassigned to a stronger position. He did not slip away in the night when escape was still theoretically possible. He stayed when the guns stopped and the terrible silence fell, and he stayed when the bugle cut through the pre-dawn dark and the columns came from every direction at once. He fired until he could not reload. He swung his rifle when the ammunition ran out. He fought with whatever he had when the rifle broke. He did not ask to be reassigned to a stronger position. He did not slip away in the night when escape was still theoretically possible. He did not send word east begging for extraction. He made the same choice every morning for 13 days, and the choice was always the same: stay. There is a kind of courage that is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with speeches. It does not require an audience. It is the quiet, daily decision to remain in a place that is becoming more dangerous by the hour, when leaving is still an option and no one would blame you for taking it. That is the courage Davy Crockett demonstrated in those 13 days. Whatever happened in the final 90 minutes, it was built on that foundation. Maybe the ambiguity of his death is not a flaw in the historical record. Maybe it is the most honest thing about Davy Crockett's story. A man that complicated, part politician, part frontiersman, part myth, even while he was still alive, deserves a death that resists easy answers. The legend wanted a hero surrounded by corpses. The commanding general wanted proof that the red flag's promise had been kept. Crockett himself had wanted Texas, a fresh start, land on a new frontier, the kind of beginning that middle age does not usually permit. He found the Alamo instead. Whether he died with a rifle swung overhead or with a bayonet in his chest, As he stood unarmed before a man who fancied himself Napoleon, the result was the same. Davy Crockett died in the Alamo. He died defending a wall that could not hold. He died with the men beside him. Return to that image from the beginning, 5:30 in the morning. A former United States congressman crouching behind a crumbling wall in the dark, gripping a rifle he could no longer reload, while 2,000 soldiers closed in from every direction. We now know what happened in those 90 minutes. The converging columns, the palisade overrun, the rooms cleared one by one with cannon and bayonet, the silence that fell like a hammer when the last shot was fired. We know about the executions ordered in the battle's aftermath and the 16 bodies found around a single man. We know that the truth of Crockett's final moment may never be fully recovered from the smoke and blood and contradictory testimony of that morning. But we know this: Davy Crockett walked into the Alamo. He defended its weakest wall. And whatever happened in those final seconds, whether surrounded by the men he had killed or standing unarmed in the rubble where he had fought, one thing is certain, and has always been certain: he did not leave. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are always darker corners still to come.